good to be together this evening. Wanted to draw our attention to an application that I had thought of. Actually, someone brought it to me. Was considering different views of how our faith is developed. And this is one that's always kind of stuck in my mind and has helped me at different times when I felt like maybe my faith wasn't as strong as what it ought to be. Times when maybe we can get overly discouraged because maybe as we're gauging ourselves and we wonder, shouldn't I be maybe further along? And maybe even when we read certain passages of Scripture, it's almost just so matter of fact, this is what is expected of us. And maybe can, if we're honest with ourselves, question, well, why is that not seen? Why is that the fruit of that seen in its fullest sense? And is there something wrong with me? Is there something that I should be overly concerned about? And I'm sure there are times in our life when maybe there are things that maybe need to be severely and immediately addressed. But oftentimes it's just the natural process of how we grow. And this was brought to my attention. Someone had this illustration, and I just really appreciated it. Was giving me the idea that there is a company. I was not aware of this until someone made this known to me. There's a company that predominantly produces albums that are what you would call bootleg versions. And for those who are into music and really find maybe a particular group or particular sound you like, of course, when you just get the albums, those aren't enough, and you had to find what more can you get your hands on. And bootleg versions are really great for people who want to get just as much as a particular sound of all the variety, all the different variations, and people just get really into that. Well, this company, it's just, if you ever saw a record that had that image of that pig, it's a trademark of quality. If you were a music enthusiast, you would be very, very excited because you'd be, this is a bootleg. In other words, this is something that kind of behind the scenes of the polished, completed, maybe a version that they play on the radio that's packaged in the albums. And also something that's very of great interest for a lot of people when maybe they're trying to get maybe deeper into what was going through someone's mind as they were writing a particular song. What was that process like as they were putting it together? Was it easy? Was it hard? Did it take months and months to put together? And this particular company was very well known in providing a lot of musical enthusiasts that kind of joy. It provided an image or a deeper kind of behind-the-scenes view of the process of a lot of their great songs. Groups like the Beatles is one just particular group. I'm sure most people, when they hear the albums or hear the music, they maybe believe that they just have this superior talent. They could just kind of go into the studio and just put a couple riffs together, and boom, you got an album. And this was kind of a behind-the-scenes look, and that was interesting. A lot of their music that was produced by this particular company revealed that there were a lot of raw sound of wrong notes played. Imagine, yes, some of the members of the Beatles missing notes. Some of them were even singing off key in certain songs. In some songs, you actually hear them messing up halfway through it. If you knew maybe what the album version was, you're kind of maybe astonished. Wow, they're actually struggling to kind of put this together, and they're kind of working through it and trying to get it, and so they have to start over again and again and again. And for some people, maybe that's maybe not great interest, but for some, it is a great window into, again, revealing that in some ways, some of these great artists that have no doubt have amazing talent and ability are often in some ways not that much unlike us. And that, very rarely does it seem like, anyone could just kind of just off the top of their head just kind of put a gold record together or put an award-winning song just in one sitting. And that's rarely the case for a lot of other individuals as well. And the application that was trying to piece together is that it's interesting how throughout the Scriptures, when we look at what is encouraged for us to achieve, the goals for us in our faith, especially when we get to a section it's called the Hall of Fame of Faith. And you look at certain individuals, and what we find is that we have been given kind of the finished version of certain individuals, especially in the New Testament. But we also have kind of a bootleg account of some of these individuals. And if you would go behind the scenes of some of this, the airbrushed kind of titles of names like Abraham, Moses, David, we're going to look through the book of Hebrews. The Old Testament is kind of like what you might call the bootleg version of their journey of faith. People missing wrong notes. People having to start over again. People not quite getting it just right. But then you go to the completed version in that whole book of Hebrews, just as if you were to go to the Hall of Fame in Cleveland, Ohio, and you might see all the names of all these accomplished musicians, you might get the impression, boy, they must be just absolutely perfect most of their life. And again, even that institution is designed to give you clues and pieces. I remember that one of my favorite items that I got to look at in the Hall of Fame was one famous musician and a very famous song, and there was a piece of paper where you could see scribbled out lyrics. And you could see where there were like circles drawn, and maybe he had written something, and that's not working. And he crossed it out, and it kind of gave a reveal of the scenes that they're a little bit more human to them. You know, this is a natural process, and it isn't just kind of instantaneous, and they just have some kind of special form of genius. There's no denying their talent and special ability. But I thought it was a good application for us to consider concerning our faith this evening. Another image that kind of goes along with that is you're looking at a duck and he's swimming across the water. It's always kind of interesting. It almost seems like they're just gliding so effortlessly. And you see that image, it just seems like they're just so, without any effort, just so, just almost perfectly. There's nothing going on. It's just kind of gliding so smoothly. But if you were to look beneath the surface, you'd find those webbed feet are working very hard. And something you can almost see the struggle, if you could see that, of them trying to keep up. That's what we don't see. What we don't see are their feet below the surface working hard to propel them through the water. And I think there's something maybe to consider as we are maybe looking at certain individuals that we aspire to be like, certain individuals that we're trying to emulate. It's helpful when we realize that if we look deep into the specifics of their own development, we kind of see that there is kind of a bootleg version of the polished draft that sometimes we have given as an example of what we're supposed to be shooting for. In Philippians chapter 2, verses 12 through 13, an interesting passage. It says, so then, my beloved, just as you have always obeyed, not as in my presence only, but now much more in my absence, he says, work out your salvation with fear and trembling. And just with this particular application, that's sometimes what I tend to think about when I read that passage now. And I think about this company producing all these bootleg albums, and what you might hear are the frustration of musicians helping each other maybe overcome some wrong note that they played, or maybe confessing, this just isn't working. Let's try something else out. And reveals the actual reality of finished products, especially those that maybe we treasure them, we admire them, that they stick in our memories, in our hearts, and we become so attached to them that sometimes it's hard to even imagine a time when it was almost kind of just molding itself into existence in a time in its infantile state where it may not have sounded so pretty, may not have sounded so together, may not have sounded so appealing. But that's what this company prided itself in, and a lot of the consumers liked that aspect, that it's revealing this aspect that, wait a minute, we kind of hear these people working out these pieces of music. And that really tends to be the idea behind that particular verse. That yes, we have a goal that we need to get to, but don't be discouraged by the working out process of your faith. It's gonna kind of have a bootleg quality to it at times. It's not going to be polished. It's not going to be perfect. It's not going to be complete. That's what we're aiming for. And if there are individuals who certainly would never be dismissive. Well, I'm never listening to their records ever again. I mean, listen to them. They sound like they're a bunch of amateurs. No one would ever say that. They'd say, well, of course, it's just kind of interesting that we see they're just human like anybody else. And this is kind of something I think we need to encourage each other with, and to realize that the Lord does allow for our struggling, weak humanity to work out these bold, challenging aspects of spiritual goals and development. And it's a natural process. One example I want to look at is in Mark chapter 11. Go to Mark chapter 11. Just give an example. Even some of the things we see Jesus speaking about or Jesus identifying. And of course, Jesus is always very matter of fact about this is what you need to do. In fact, when we talked about one aspect of forgiveness this morning, remember when Peter himself was struggling with the concept of forgiveness. And he said, well, at some point in time, I guess you're going to have to kind of, say, I don't know if I can do much more for you. And he said, what is it, like 7? And I'm sure he probably thought it was being pretty generous. He said 7 times. I'm sure he'd probably done. And the Lord said, no. How about 70 times 7? You know what's interesting? The immediate response of the disciples was after hearing that, that's what you demand of us. That's what you require. They said, increase our faith. It was almost they were saying, we're like the bootleg version of what you're asking for us. You're saying this is the complete product. We're not there yet. And you know what Jesus said? That's okay. Pray about it. That if you have faith the size of a mustard seed, you can do all kinds of things, but it's about believing and putting that faith in God to help us develop. And if we put our faith in Him, we can get there. But so that's what we need to kind of keep that in mind, that oftentimes when we see Jesus giving a matter-of-fact statement of this is what you need to shoot for, we also need to be very lenient with ourselves and each other as we realize it is a process that's going to be rocky and kind of growing together and having some growing pains with it. But turn over there to Mark chapter 11. In Mark chapter 11, I want to read in verse 12. Mark 11 verse 12 says, on the next day when they had left Bethany, he became hungry. Seeing at a distance a fig tree and leaf, he went to see if perhaps he would find anything on it. And when he came to it, he found nothing but leaves, for it was not the season for figs. He said to it, may no one ever eat fruit from you again. And his disciples were listening. Now we drop down to verse 20. Mark 11, verse 20. It says, as they were passing by in the morning, they saw the fig tree withered from the roots up. Being reminded, Peter said to him, Rabbi, look, the fig tree which you cursed has withered. And Jesus answered, saying to them, have faith in God. This is one of those, again, statements that I sometimes look at that and say, okay, Daniel, have faith in God. He says, I just believe it, I can do it, right? Yet if we're honest with ourselves, it's not as simple as that. And I don't believe Jesus is expecting it to be that simplistic. What he's doing, no doubt, is challenging our current status, saying, can you do a little bit more? Can you rise to a different level? All the while knowing it's going to take some time for us to get there. But notice that he says, here's what you do. You need to have faith in God. And notice what he says in verse 23. He says, truly I say to you, whoever says to this mountain, be taken up and cast into the sea, and does not doubt in his heart, but believes that what he says is going to happen, it will be granted him. Therefore I say to you, all things for which you pray and ask, believe that you have received them, and they will be granted you. Whenever you stand praying, forgive, if you have anything against anyone, so that your Father who is in heaven will also forgive you your transgressions. But if you do not forgive, neither will your Father who is in heaven forgive your transgressions. And so just as a kind of a general encouraging lesson, if for whatever reason there are areas of our faith that we feel is just not quite up to the level of what we see sometimes Jesus demanding or saying is possible, what he expects of us, I want to go very quickly to that kind of polished Hall of Fame chapter and compare that with kind of what we might say is the bootleg version of these polished, completed definitions. For example, go to Hebrews chapter 11. Hebrews chapter 11. And we note that right off the bat, in case we need some encouragement with our faith, and that's exactly what Hebrews 11 is all about. Hebrews 11 begins by telling us that we cannot please God unless we have faith. He who comes to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of those who diligently seek him. He makes it clear that is the only way I can please God. And so right off the bat you read that, and it might, again, kind of have that daunting feeling of, what if I'm not quite there yet? I know that's what he says. That's the only way I can please God, is I have to have this confident faith. In fact, James even talks about wavering faith. That's something we need to grow to be a little bit more stronger about and prevent that. And then to encourage, it says, here's what I'm talking about. Let's look at some examples of some individuals that meet this definition and meet this requirement. And just starts going through some names. But notice there in Hebrews chapter 11 and read verse 6. It says, without faith, it is impossible to please him. For he who comes to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of those who seek him. And then we have these names of examples of people who did just that. Verse 7, by faith, Noah, being warned by God about things not yet seen, in reverence, prepared an ark for the salvation of his household, by which he condemned the world. And he became an heir of the righteousness which is according to faith. Verse 8, by faith Abraham, when he was called, obeyed by going out to a place which he was to receive for an inheritance. And he went out, not knowing where he was going. By faith he lived as an alien in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, fellow heirs of the same promise. For he was looking for the city which has foundations, whose architect and builder is God. By faith even Sarah herself received ability to conceive, even beyond the proper time of life, since she considered him faithful who had promised. Therefore there was born even of one man, and him as good as dead as that, as many descendants as the stars of heaven in number, and innumerable as the sand which is by the seashore. And on the chapter unravels itself and proceeds to point to really these completed images of people who have examples of this faith that pleases God. And lest we ever get discouraged by that, and we see a major discrepancy between where we are and where these finished products are, if ever it becomes any more evident, it's just reading down at the end of the list, especially when you get to the name of Gideon, which, if we're familiar with the story of Gideon, I think also sets a precedent for really, it's not just Gideon, it's all these names that really we find that this is a process. We go down and notice among the names who he says, I'm talking about people like this. And don't forget about people like this. And I just don't have time to go into great detail. But notice what he says as we drop down to verse 30. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 30 says, by faith, the walls of Jericho fell down after they had been encircled for 7 days. By faith, Rahab the harlot did not perish along with those who were disobedient, after she had welcomed the spies in peace. And in verse 32, it says, and what more shall I say? For time will fail me if I tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, of David and Samuel and the prophets. And right there, just for a moment, I want to go back there to the book of Judges Judges chapter 6, when you notice that the name of Gideon pops up and we see him as an example, hopefully there is a sense of relief or a sense that we can identify with what he's saying, and that when we look at the kind of story of Gideon's development, we find the first time we meet Gideon, his faith is really nothing that is of stellar proportion. In fact, it's something that he's wrestling with. Gideon is struggling with his faith the first time we meet him. And it says, I want to tell you that a guy like Gideon is exactly who I'm talking about when I talk about a faith that pleases God. And so let's go back there to the book of Judges, in Judges chapter 6. And notice the first thing that we begin learning about him is he is full of questions. And these questions have led to a little bit of a doubt. And if you would say some people are a glass is kind of half full kind of person, and some of a glass is kind of half empty, Gideon would be, not only is it half empty, but I'm losing water. He said, I don't know how much more half we're going to have here. He was not a very optimistic, trusting guy the first time we learn about him. Notice it says in Judges chapter 6 and verse 11. It says, Then the angel of the Lord came and sat under the oak that was in Ophrah, which belonged to Joash the Abiezrite, as his son Gideon was beating out wheat in the wine press in order to save it from the Midianites. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him and said to him, The Lord is with you, O valiant warrior. Then Gideon said to him, O my Lord, if the Lord is with us, why then has all this happened to us? And where are all his miracles which our fathers told us about, saying, Did not the Lord bring us up from Egypt? But now the Lord has abandoned us and given us into the hand of Midian. The Lord looked at him and said, Go, and this your strength, and deliver Israel from the hand of Midian. Have I not sent you? He said to him, O Lord, how shall I deliver Israel? Behold, my family is the least in Manasseh, and I am the youngest in my father's house. In Gideon's eyes, this idea is seeming far and far distant and almost an impossibility. In verse 16 it says, But the Lord said to him, Surely I will be with you, and you shall defeat Midian as one man. So Gideon said to him, If now I have found favor in your sight, then show me a sign that it is you who speak with me. Please do not depart from here until I come back to you and bring out my offering and lay it before you. And he said, I will remain until you return. And in verse 19, the Lord demonstrates a great sign. It says, Gideon went in and prepared a young goat and unleavened bread and from an ephah of flour. He put the meat in a basket and the broth in a pot and brought them out to him under the oak and presented them. And the angel of God said to him, Take the meat and the unleavened bread and lay them on this rock. Pour out the broth. And he did so. Then the angel of the Lord put out the end of the staff that was in his hand and touched the meat and the unleavened bread, and fire sprang up from the rock and consumed the meat and the unleavened bread. Then the angel of the Lord vanished from his sight. When Gideon saw that he was the angel of the Lord, he said, Alas, O Lord God, for now I have seen the angel of the Lord face to face. The Lord said to him, Peace to you. Do not fear. You shall not die. Then Gideon built an altar there to the Lord and named it, The Lord is Peace. To this day, it is still in Ophrah in the Abiezrites. Now, if we're working backwards from the first time, at least we read them in the New Testament in the book of Hebrews, in your own mind, you think, well, Gideon is supposed to be this example of faith that pleases God. So if maybe you're kind of the first to learn of this story, maybe you're thinking, well, I'm sure that as soon as he got the confirmation, he was full of confidence, right? No, he's still struggling. Even after God reveals himself in this miraculous way, trust me, I'm with you. He gets a test. Gideon, I want to see how much you trust me. Go tear down your father's idols. He did so, but he did it in a way that he wondered, is God going to protect me? Maybe I got to do this. in a most secret, stealthy possible way. He was afraid of getting caught. Afraid of what might happen. Notice here in verse 25. It says in verse 25, now on the same night that he has the Lord reveal himself, I am with you. You don't have to be afraid of anything. He's still afraid. He's still afraid even after the Lord was trying to help him. It says on the same night the Lord said to him, take your father's bull and a second bull 7 years old and pull down the altar of Baal which belongs to your father and cut down the Asherah that is beside it and build an altar to the Lord your God on the top of his stronghold in an orderly manner, and take a second bull and offer a burnt offering with the wood of the Asherah, which you shall cut down. Then Gideon took men of his servants and did as the Lord had spoken to him, and because he was too afraid of his father's household and the men of the city to do it by day, he did it by night. This is a man who is still struggling to have confidence that God is with him. Now, something interesting happens. He does it by night. And, of course, all his fears start to come when, people are angry. People are furious that he does. And guess what? His father defends him. And one of the most amazing statements of wisdom. His father basically says, well, if these are such great gods, well, let them take care of it. They're so angry. Let these gods take care of it if he really needs to deal with it. Notice what the father says. In verse 28, when the men of the city arose early in the morning, behold, the altar of Baal was torn down, and the Asherah, which was beside it, was cut down, and the second bull was offered on the altar which had been built. They said to one another, who did this thing? And when they searched out and inquired, they said, Gideon, the son of Joash, did this thing. And then the men of the city said to Joash, bring out your son, that he may die, for he has torn down the altar of Baal, and indeed he has cut down the Asherah which was beside it. So even against Gideon's attempts to try to make sure no one knows, he still found out. Remember, he's terrified of this happening. Because it's in his mind, if they find out I'm the culprit, I'm dead. But the wisdom of his father saves him. In verse 31, Joash said to all who stood against him, will you contend for Baal, or will you deliver him? Whoever will plead for him shall be put to death by morning. If he is a god, let him contend for himself, because someone has torn down his altar. Therefore on that day he named him Jerubbaal, that is to say, let Baal contend against him, because he had torn down his altar. Even against Gideon's fears, God holds up his end and says, yes, I'm going to be with you. You may not understand how, but I will protect you. So a man like Gideon, whose name is in the hall of fame of faith, now surely he's confident. Now he's ready to go. Now he has no qualms, right? No. He still doesn't know. He's still, I don't know about all this. Lord, will you please give me a sign? Drop down to verse 36. In verse 36, then Gideon said to God, if you will deliver Israel through me, as you have spoken, behold, I will put a fleece of wool on the threshing floor. If there is dew on the fleece only, and it is dry on all the ground, then I will know that you will deliver Israel through me, as you have spoken. And it was so. When he arose early the next morning and squeezed the fleece, he drained the dew from the fleece, a bowl full of water. You ever feel like sometimes you say something and then it comes true and you're like, uh-oh, that just propelled me a little bit closer to what I don't know if I'm quite ready for this. Gideon is still, even after his father delivers him from the irate anger of the enemies and the protectors of Baal, that's what he was afraid of. He didn't want that to happen. It happened, but God protects him. The angel shows him he's with him, and now God answers his. And notice again, he said, well, time out. I'm not quite ready to go. One more thing. I just need one more sign. In verse 39, Gideon said to God, do not let your anger burn against me, that I may speak once more. Please let me make a test once more with the fleece. Let it now be dry only on the fleece, and let there be dew on all the ground. God did so that night, for it was dry only on the fleece, and dew was all on the ground. Then we see in chapter 7, God takes another step to have him demonstrate his faith. He says, you got too many men in your army. We've got to cut that down. They get the number down to 300. And then something very interesting happens. Gideon overhears some things that helps him. In verse 9, Judges chapter 7, verse 9 says, now the same night it came about that the Lord said to him, arise, go down against the camp, for I have given it into your hands. But if you are afraid to go down, go with Purah your servant down to the camp, and you will hear what they say. And afterward your hands will be strengthened, that you may go down against the camp. Notice, so the Lord gives him two options. The first option is, now if by this time you're convinced that I'm with you, and you're ready to kind of exercise this faith that I'm trying to build, then you go ahead and just go down yourself. But maybe you're not there yet. I love that. Maybe you're not there yet. That's what he's essentially saying. Now, this is what I think you can do. This is what I think you should do. This is what I know you would be able to do. But just in case you're not there yet. If you're not there yet, then guess what? If you're too afraid, there's someone else you can take to go down with you. Guess what option Gideon chooses? I'm not there yet. I'm not there yet. He gives him the second option. Go ahead, take Purah with you. So he went with Purah, his servant, down to the outpost of the army that was in the camp. Now the Midianites and the Amalekites and all the sons of the east were lying in the valley as numerous as locusts, and their camels were without number, as numerous as the sand on the seashore. When Gideon came, behold, a man was relating a dream to his friend. And he said, behold, I had a dream. A loaf of barley bread was tumbling into the camp of Midian, and it came to the tent and struck it so that it fell, and turned it upside down, so that the tent lay flat. His friend replied, this is nothing less than the sword of Gideon, the son of Joash, a man of Israel. God has given Midian and all the camp into his hand. And all of a sudden, Gideon gets this tremendous boost of confidence, of faith, that now my enemies, they believe that God is with me. Well, now what stopped me? He needed that he needed to build and grow in that before he could finally pick up the sword as that valiant warrior the angel said he was. And it's at this moment that things change. Notice verse 15. When Gideon heard the account of the dream and its interpretation, he bowed in worship. He returned to the camp of Israel and said, arise, for the Lord has given the camp of Midian into your hands. I take great faith and great encouragement in this. And it's almost like an individual who's been hearing sermons, seeing examples over and over, and just maybe one day just something clicks. Maybe there's one particular lesson of faith in the scriptures that maybe they just hadn't thought about it. It's like, if that's what happened, then surely, now I know. It's almost he said, now I know, yes, everything he's been telling me is true, and I can do this. And from this point on, he doesn't look back. In verse 16, it says, he divided the 300 men into 3 companies, and he put trumpets and empty pitchers into the hands of all of them with torches inside the pitchers. He said to them, look at me and do likewise. And behold, when I come to the outskirts of the camp, do as I do. When I and all who are with me blow the trumpet, then you also blow the trumpets all around the camp and say, for the Lord and for Gideon. So in other words, when we read that quick description, you know the faith I'm talking about? Faith that pleases God. Faith that believes that God is. and he rewards those who diligently seek him. Gideon's an example of that. Yeah, the finished product. But there's also a bootleg version of him not being quite always on key, where he's learning. In other words, hopefully this gives us a little window, saying the Lord understands it's going to take some time for us. He doesn't expect it to be instantaneous. In fact, another great example, Abraham is another one. There in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 8, it says, by faith Abraham, when he was called, obeyed by going out to a place which he was to receive for an inheritance. And he went out, not knowing where he was going. And again, when you read Abram's life in Hebrews chapter 11, it's almost like you're getting that finished product of that musician you look up to, and you believe that they have all this talent, all this ability, and you just say, wow, man, this guy just spot on, just absolute excellence. But there's a bootleg version of this, actually, in the scriptures, and the book of Genesis. Something happened along the way to that land that he trusted God was going to give to him. And he finds that there's a famine in the land. And that famine worried him and bothered him so much he took a detour and he went to Egypt. And then when he gets to Egypt, he turns to his wife and says, they're going to kill me because of you. If ever there's an opportunity to blame your wife and not your marriage, it's just because you're so pretty. You're so beautiful. you're so beautiful that when they see me, they're going to kill me. So make it well with me. Just say you're my sister, okay? We'll just leave it at that. So she agrees. She says, I'm his sister. Well, of course, word gets out. This beautiful woman is in the land. They send the word up to Pharaoh. You got to see this beautiful woman. He takes her as his wife. And Abraham's making out. They gave him all kinds of camels. They treated him well because of this woman that he brought in. Then something happened. God struck Pharaoh and all his household with plagues. And it comes to realize, what? This is not your sister. He gets angry. Why did you do this? If Abraham were to give the answer, like Gideon, I was scared. Didn't God tell you? Yeah, he told me. In other words, there's more to the story than just that completed plaster picture. This is who I be like this. Yes, and that's the goal. That's what we're striving for. In fact, there's a great phrase, just one last scripture I want to look at here in Romans chapter 4. And we'll put this all together. But turn over to Romans chapter 4. Romans chapter 4 is kind of the realistic picture of the real life development of what Abraham's faith was like. Romans chapter 4 verse 16 says, for this reason it is by faith, in order that it may be in accordance with grace, so that the promise will be guaranteed to all the descendants, not only to those who are of the law, but also to those who are of the faith of Abraham, who is the father of us all. So this great point Paul's making is how important faith is. Faith is vital. Again, as Hebrews says, it's the only way we can please God. Not by works of the law, by faith. It gives us an example of Abraham's faith. It's just like this guy Abraham. He says in verse 17, as it is written, a father of many nations have I made you in the presence of him who he believed, even God, who gives life to the dead and calls into being that which does not exist. In hope against hope, he believed, so that he might become a father of many nations. According to that which had been spoken, so shall your descendants be. Without becoming weak in faith, he contemplated his own body, now as good as dead, since he was about 100 years old, and the deadness of Sarah's womb. Now note verse 20. Yet with respect to the promise of God, he did not waver in unbelief, but grew strong. It was a process. And along that process, Abraham did struggle. It's not that he gave up or he he just completely abandoned the project. No, he continued on. It's just that there were certain actions that he took that suggested he was not just fully confident in everything God was doing. And so for me, the point is that if we could get to the book of Hebrews, and he says here, I'm talking about people like Abraham, people like Gideon. For me, I take great comfort because in many ways, it's kind of like the great elation and joy maybe someone has it looking at some amazing, talented musician and getting that bootleg version. What do you mean, just like it is when I'm in my garage and I'm just kind of playing around, and they stumble along. It's not just boom. It's a perfect, amazing, Grammy-winning song. And I take great courage because in many ways, that's what we should take from these individuals when we look at their lives, when we see the finished product. These were men with a like nature like ours. That's the confidence we get from the book of James. One final passage, we'll end it on that note. But turn to James. James chapter 5. And note what he says in verse 16. James chapter 5:16. He says, therefore, confess your sins to one another and pray for one another so that you may be healed. The effective prayer of a righteous man can't accomplish much. He says, how about like Elijah? But notice what he says, Elijah was a man with a nature like ours. There were times in his life, and we know very well, all too well, times when he doubted. Times when he had questions and he didn't know the answers to them, and they brought him sense of hesitation and frustration and defeat. Yet, what did he do? Let me show you the example of him when he finally had confidence. He prayed earnestly that it would not rain, and it did not rain on the earth for 3 years and 6 months. Then he prayed again, and the sky poured rain, and the earth produced its fruit. So just one kind of lesson in terms of that passage, working out our salvation. If that's what's happening, if that's what's going on, as long as you are putting in the effort and you're reading, you're studying, you're putting yourself out there, you're accepting those tests, but maybe there are times when you realize maybe it's not as pretty as what it ought to look, maybe not as polished what it ought to look. You're no different than all these other people in the Hall of Fame category. Abraham, Moses, Samson, Gideon. And so let us not get overly discouraged. We find that our performance or confidence of faith at times can be less than stellar. Let's just continue to, by diligence, continue to read, study, build that faith, and continue moving forward. And God will work with us, build us, and teach us and keep moving us along. If anyone is with us, has never obeyed the gospel of Jesus Christ, again, what we take great comfort in is even as you become a Christian, just think of your journey, much like that of what they give the illustration of the duck gliding across the water. Maybe you see certain disciples and say, well, I'd like to be a Christian, but I don't know if I'm in the caliber of this Christian or this one I see. It almost seems like it's just, no, don't let that deceive you either. There's things beneath the surface, the struggles that maybe we just don't know about, the development of years in the past where maybe it wasn't always smooth. That no, it's not going to be perfect, but we need to initiate that faith and put our trust initially in God that He might be able to save us. So if anyone is willing to confess that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God, and repenting of sin to be baptized in water for forgiveness, we encourage you to take advantage of this opportunity. If anyone has done that and needs to come to repentance, we encourage you to come and make things right while we have the opportunity. Why don't you stand and come to the front while we sing this song of encouragement.